Glad to see such a nice crowd here tonight. In our world, faith and reason are often treated as mutually exclusive and incompatible approaches to reality. The assumption you often run into is that either you're committed to a scientific truth, in which case there's no place for religion, or vice versa, you're committed to religious truth, there's no place for science. And you can see that antagonism, that dichotomy at work in the way so often each side speaks of the other, with hostility, with contemptuous dismissal, with grudging acknowledgement, or patronizing tolerance. John's approach is very different from that. He's a committed Christian believer with a passionate interest in science, not to mention an excellent mind and a gift for lucid exposition that you're going to experience soon. And in these talks, he approaches the question of faith and reason, of scientific and religious truth, from and through an unabashed appreciation of all that modern science has achieved. And yet he does not find in these amazingly great achievements of science warrant to dismiss or despise other ways of understanding the reality of the world in which we live, and especially the religious account of reality. Indeed, for all the great achievements of science, he's going to argue that science alone is not sufficient to understand the reality in which we exist. There are fundamental questions on which revealed truth and theology deserve open-minded and very serious hearing. So if you're familiar with the kind of polarized antagonism of science and religion, faith and reason, which is so commonly the way these questions are approached, you may think that John is a kind of eccentric, some sort of oddball. Well, there's something to that, but go back into the history of religion and the history of science, not only before the modern era, but during the modern era. And you'll find that there's a fruitful complementarity of faith and reason, scientific and religious truth, and that was taken for granted by almost everyone in the debate. For centuries, it was not thought odd for devout Christians to be serious scientists, or for serious scientists to be devout Christians. And of course there were tensions and disagreements, some of them notorious. I don't have to name Galileo. But then, when you look, there are tensions and disagreements between theologians and between scientists as well. The disagreement is the essence of our growth and quest for a deeper understanding of reality. For us to focus only on those differences and to somehow present those as the only relation of science and religion, of faith and reason, is unhistoric. In the long history of the human quest for understanding, more often than not, faith and reason, science and religion have stood in complementary relationship with each other. And that's the relationship that John's talks are going to seek to restore. That's the tradition which, in a modest way, we want to try to reclaim, in which a robust account of revelation, of religious truth, can stand together with a robust account of reason and scientific truth. And it's our hope that John's talk will stimulate much reflection and discussion. There'll be a time for question and answer after he's finished, and afterwards you're invited to stay for refreshments and further discussion, if you will. And of course, if any of you are not members of St. John's and interested in knowing more about the religion that we teach here and pray here and try to practice, I do invite you to join us on Sundays at 10:30 for our main event. And I guess the obligatory request to silence your cell phones is in order. John.
Thank you, Gavin. Appreciate that very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
It's a little daunting to have this many people. This is not what I normally do, but I'll take my best shot at it. As you know, in our contemporary society, science tends to dominate the intellectual discussion in an increasingly secular culture. And to a certain extent, I think this is understandable. Science has accomplished many wonderful and interesting things, and the way they've done it is nothing short of fascinating and remarkable. And I'll give you a few examples of that. In April 1990, we launched the Hubble telescope. And after we fixed the vision problems with a sort of a set of glasses, it has really been remarkable what we've been able to see in the far-flung universe. The galaxies that are as far back, are as far away as 13.4 billion years away, fairly close to when the Big Bang is supposed to have occurred. And as you know, as you look in far distant space, you're also looking back in time. In 2021, we're going to launch the next version of a space telescope, which is the James Webb, which will be even more powerful. Another achievement was in 2012, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland. A particle accelerator was used to detect the Higgs boson. Let me tell you a couple of things about that. A particle accelerator you may be familiar with, but it's a 17-mile loop with magnets that accelerate particles to somewhere close to the speed of light, and then they collide them and they smash them together and see what comes out of it. In this case, what they were trying to find was something called the Higgs boson, which is also referred to as the God particle. And the reason it's so important is the theory was it should be produced by the Higgs field. The Higgs field is something that permeates all of space and gives particles their mass. So identifying this was actually a huge deal. And so they ran a number of tests, blew up these particles, and then looked at what they found in the detritus of this collision. And what they determined is that they did see the Higgs boson, which existed. It's a very unstable particle. It existed for less than 1/10 trillionth of a second before it decayed into other matter. It took teams of scientists months to analyze all this data, but at the end of that analysis, they concluded that they had, in all likelihood, seen the Higgs boson, which was a huge deal. In September 2015, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO for short, detected gravitational waves for the first time. Gravitational waves are disturbances in space-time, and in order to detect them, they had to develop a detection device that could detect changes less than 1/1000th of the width of a proton, which is very, very small indeed. But more interesting to me is that not only did they detect gravitational waves, by understanding how they were composed, they were able to determine that this was the result of a merger of two black holes in a particular point in the universe millions of light years away, which is really quite remarkable. In biology, in 2001, we decoded the first human genome, and since then we have done many more genomes of both human beings and other life forms. And this has huge implications for understanding life as well as for science and medicine. By decoding the genome, we were able to see connections between us and other living things to help us understand the differences and the similarities. We were also able to look back in time because the genome has been developed over a very, very, very long period of time. So when you look at a genome, you're actually looking back in history. And now with the understanding of the genome and technology like CRISPR that allows you to go in and actually change the genome in very specific ways, it has huge implications for medical science in a couple of ways. One is you can actually, the hope is that we'll be able to change the genome for people that have genetic diseases like Huntington's disease, but we'll also be able to tailor therapies based on your particular genome to make them much more effective. So, I mean, these are just, to me, these are really remarkable achievements, and I'm constantly impressed by the ingenuity and intelligence that human beings have been able to bring to the table in science. We're constantly pushing back the frontiers of science, and I think it's a reasonable question to ask, is there anything that science cannot accomplish? Are there any questions that science is not going to be able to answer? And in fact, this is a question that I began to ask when I was in my 20s. I was actually baptized here at St. John's and was a member of the church and came occasionally, but we were not a particularly religious family. And in my 20s, when I started dating now my wife, Mary, I started going to church with her pretty regularly. And it was really the first time that I had taken my own faith seriously. But I was very scientifically oriented. I really appreciated the scientific method and what it had accomplished. And I asked myself some difficult questions. One is the God of the Bible something other than a God we created to explain things we don't understand, which is the God of the gaps? Or did we just create God to give us comfort in our darkest hours? Another way to look at this is, why would I believe in a God that could not withstand the same level of scrutiny that we bring to science? And so as I began to look at those issues, I needed to get answers to them. And the way that I approached this was to look at physics primarily. I don't know if you're familiar with the hierarchy of sciences, but it typically goes with the most fundamental of them, which is physics, and then it builds from there: chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, and lots of iterations in between. With physics is where you really are looking at the basic structure of the universe, and my hope was I would find that that's where the connection between faith and science would be, and in fact, for me, that has been the case. So over the last 40 years, I have read a lot and studied this, and I've answered this question to my own satisfaction. And my goal here is to share some of what I have learned over that period of time, and hope that you will find some of this of value as well. In doing this work and presenting this information, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian. I am a simple recovering lawyer searching for the truth. The information that I will provide over the next few weeks is available to anyone with an interest and a willingness to take the time to look it up. There are four things that I hope to be able to show you about science. One is, and I've already started on this, what a remarkable success science has been, and how much we have actually learned about the physical universe in which we live. But secondly, science has some very specific inherent limits in the scope of what it's able to achieve. And I don't think most people appreciate that, and we'll talk a lot about that over the next few weeks. Third, science has learned things that science simply cannot explain. In other words, we've learned something about an observation, but we don't really know why it's the way it is or how it got to be there. And we're going to talk a good bit about that next week. And the final limitation that I think is important to recognize is that science is a work in progress. And we are not nearly at the finish line. And in fact, if you really look at this, the more difficult and complex the science is, the more we learn we don't understand, and the more we have to try to understand. And so during our lifetimes, we'll never reach the goal line. We'll always have incomplete information. So what I'm going to try to achieve in the next few weeks are a number of things. First, I hope to provide some information that you don't know, both about science and its limitations. I hope by providing perhaps a somewhat different perspective than you have been exposed to in the past, which is this is We're covering most of scientific knowledge in about 4 weeks. So it is a very broad perspective. It has a particular focus, but I'm hoping maybe that particular perspective and focus provides something that you didn't have before. I hope that you will recognize that these are in fact important issues to understand what really comprises reality, how this was formed and the reality that we exist in, and hopefully make a commitment to resolve those issues for yourself and then live out the decisions that you make. And for me, making the decision is easy. Living in accordance with those decisions is much more difficult. And I guess the most important thing is I will really have been successful, I think, if you walk away from this and understand in a way that you didn't before that there really is space for God in understanding reality. Something other than science is necessary to understand all there is. How you fill in that space is really beyond the scope of these talks. That's Gavin's job. But my own conclusion is that God provides the most elegant and likely answer to fill that space. And that'll be a decision that you will need to make. I want to make a few points about this talk, these talks as sort of a basis. One is, and this is a philosophical assumption that I believe in, but it is the basis of all the work that I've done and these talks as well, is that there is one truth. There is one reality. And my goal has been to try to figure out what that is. It may or may not include a God. It may or may not include a single universe or a multiverse. But I believe there is one truth, and we have the opportunity to try to figure out what that is. When I talk about truth or reality, what I'm trying to talk about is all there is. And that involves not only the physical universe, but potentially God, the seen, the unseen, all there is. And so that's what I'm trying to talk about. Sometimes I'll use the world or the universe, but in a sort of a generic sense, but that's really what I'm trying to get at. Finally, when I talk about science, what I'm trying to do is present the most generally accepted theory that is out there, that is not particularly controversial, but it's what most scientists believe. But you have to recognize that every major theory has detractors, and virtually every major theory has observations that are not consistent with it, that science has been unable to reconcile. I'm not saying they won't eventually, but there is, when you really dig into science and look at the understanding of the world, there's a lot more. There are a lot more opinions about whether those things are true or not than you might expect. Nevertheless, I think most of what I'll talk about in terms of science is pretty well accepted by the scientific community. So let me talk a little bit about the course itself, so you understand what we're doing and how we're going to go about doing it. Today, I'm really talking about the reason for the course, most of which I've now done. And then I'm going to talk about knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, how we process knowledge, and its reliability. In the second session, I'm going to talk about physics. And I find it fascinating. You may not, but the first part will be really looking at the fundamental elements of the structure of the universe, what science has learned about that, and what science can and cannot explain. The second part of that will be looking at sort of the history of our development of theories about how the world actually works, how the universe is put together, beginning with Aristotle, talking about Newton, Einstein and general relativity, and quantum mechanics. The third session will be I'll be talking about the universe, and I'll talk about the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, talk about the future of the universe, and I'll talk about the large-scale structure of the universe and our place in it. In the fourth session, I'm going to talk about the formation of the earth, the beginning of life, which I think is actually a very interesting topic, evolution, and the evolution of man. In the fifth and final session, which I think is on the 20th of October, I'm going to try to summarize what we have learned about science. I'm going to talk a little bit about John Polkinghorne. Some of you may know him. He is a theoretical physicist and also a priest, and he has written extensively about the interrelationship of science and faith. And I think he has some really interesting perspectives. And then I'm going to try to talk about how all of this actually applies in our own lives. So those are the 5 sessions, and each of them stands on their own. I know you won't be able to probably come to all of them, but I encourage you to come to any that you can, and frankly, particularly the last session when we try to pull it all together. I'm expecting these will last about 40, 45 minutes, something like that, but twice a TED Talk. I have given you outlines. Rather than using a PowerPoint for a lot of the presentation, I've given you outlines. I think outlines in a situation like this, there's a lot of information to sort of keep track of where you are, and I thought an outline would be easier to use than the PowerPoint. I will use the PowerPoint to make a few points here, but we're basically relying on the outlines so you can keep track of where you are. I'm not going to take questions during the talk, but I will open it up for questions at the end. If you have some, we can talk about that a little bit. And I would encourage you to stay and talk after the sessions. I'll be available. Would love to have a chance to talk to you. Also would encourage you to stay for wine and snacks. Episcopalians do wine and snacks really well. And I think you'll enjoy it. So let's talk a little bit about knowledge. What is it? How do we acquire it? How do we process it? And is it reliable? There is a whole branch of philosophy called epistemology, which deals with the study of knowledge and how we acquire it. I have read a little bit of that. Like most philosophy, I find it very complex and confusing. I think it's above my pay grade. So I'm going to give you a little more pragmatic view of knowledge and how we acquire it, and some of the issues with reliability that I think will provide a foundation for some of the other things we're going to talk about in the next few weeks. There are basically, in my view, there are 3 basic sources of knowledge that for us to obtain. One is we obtain most of our knowledge about the external world through our senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. This is the primary basis for science as well. But we also have our internal world, our internal subjective experiences, including emotions, love, our personal relationships with other people, our deep sense of morality, and for religious believers, a sense of revelation, a connection with the divine and the sacred, also in part mystical experiences, which have been seen in virtually all religions throughout history. But I think these are also important parts of our lives that provide information that we have to take into account. And the third is really reason. Reason is used in a couple of ways. Reason is used when we take in information about the outside world, when we make observations about the outside world. How do we make connections between them, and by making those connections, develop more information, more knowledge that we can use. And the same thing applies to our internal lives, our relationships, our sense of morality. Reason can lead us to develop new information there as well. And reason can also develop independent truths, such as philosophical truths and mathematical truths. So those are, I think, the sources of knowledge. And then there are 3 main disciplines through which we process knowledge. The first is philosophy. As you know, we have records going back to the 6th century. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, you're all familiar with. This is a definition of philosophy: the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. Philosophy is all really basically about pure reason. It takes very limited observations about people in the world and then tries to draw, achieve maximum coherence using logical deduction and argumentation. There's really no experimentation or independent verification involved with philosophy. Now, science developed out of natural philosophy, which was one of the three primary forms of philosophy in the ancient world. There was metaphysical philosophy, which dealt with existence, God, logic, tonic forms, that sort of thing. Moral philosophy, which was how to lead a good life, beauty, goodness, right and wrong, virtue. And then there was natural philosophy, which sought to make sense of the physical world. And as it advanced, it became based on more and more careful observations about the world, but it was basically qualitative rather than quantitative. But it was the precursor of modern science. So this is the definition of science: the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And the last phrase here that I've highlighted is really the key to science. It is what gives science its power, but it is also what limits science in its investigation of the world. This is the definition of an experiment: an operation or procedure carried out under controlled conditions in order to discover an unknown effect or law, to test or establish a hypothesis, or to illustrate a known law. And the key here, experimentation is really sort of the gold standard for science, because you are controlling to prevent other things from polluting the results and trying to achieve a specific result. It can be replicated by other people, and so when you're looking at science, and experimentation is really the gold standard. But it's also experiment limitation, which it has to be under controlled conditions. Well, you can't really control what happens in the far-flung universe, and so what you have to rely on there is observations. And the good news is we can observe not only what's happening today, but we can look very, very far back in time by looking very deep into the universe. All right, the next is theology, which is the study of the nature of God and religious belief. And obviously this has one key requirement, which is a metaphysical assumption that God exists, and he plays some role in the creation or an ongoing operation of the reality in which we live. But I intend to show next week in talking physics that theology is not alone in making some metaphysical assumptions on which it is based. Science does that as well. So let's talk now about some issues with the reliability of knowledge. Human beings have a cognitive structure that cannot be set aside, and that impacts what we understand about the world. And I'm going to talk about three elements here. And the first is something called qualia. And this is the internal and subjective component of sense perception deriving from stimulation of the senses by phenomena. And stated more simply, it is really our subjective experience of what is generated through our senses. So my cousin over here is wearing a pink blouse. So when I look at that, I have a subjective experience of pink. But when you look at her blouse, it may look very different to you. My subjective experience of pink and yours may be very different. And I'll give you another example. The sense of smell. Human beings have about 400 receptors in your nose that then that detect certain types of molecules and transmit information to your brain. And a particular combination of those synapses will tell you what a particular smell is. But every human being has slightly different receptors, and they process this information in slightly different ways. So at the end of the day, the world smells different to all of us. And that's the nature part. But there is also a nurture part of how we experience the world. Our prior experiences with different sensations, with smells, with colors, with sounds, impact our perception when we receive that information. And just give you a simple example, that if you have a child who sees a red car, if that child's mother has a red car and picks her up from school every day, she's going to have a immediately positive and joyous reaction when she sees that car. If another child doesn't have that situation but was involved in an accident with a red car, they're going to have a very different reaction to red and to the car, really a sense of dread. This is a very simple example, but this is how we all work in everything that we do in the world. We filter our experiences in the world through our own cognitive filters. And it's different for each person. More broadly, as human beings, we have different personalities, we have different values, we have different beliefs, we've had different experiences of all kinds. And this has two results. One is, it affects how we perceive the world, but it also affects how we interact with the world. And I'll give you a simple example. We went to a wedding this past weekend in Colorado, and wonderful event, had a great time. And if you had talked to my wife and you had talked to me after that event, you probably wouldn't think we went to the same event. If you talked to me after the event, I would have talked about how beautiful the aspen trees were and the mountains in the background, how good the food was, because I ate all of it. And the 5 people I talked to that I really learned a lot about. If you talk to my wife, she'd tell you about the wedding dress, bridesmaids' dresses. She'd tell you about the venue and how it was designed, and all about the flowers. I don't even know if there were flowers there. And she would be able to tell you a little bit about the 40 people she talked to, none of whom she'd met before. And if you know anything about my wife, you know that's true. But what it illustrates, it's a simple illustration. What it illustrates is that who we are affects how we perceive the world, what we perceive about the world, but also how we interact with the world. And we're all like this, including scientists. So you have sort of the nature and nurture of qualia. You have sort of the more broad perspective on who we are, our particular personalities and biases. But then there's a basic limitation of our minds. And if you think about the chimpanzee, which is probably as close to us as anything in terms of from an evolutionary perspective and sharing the gene pool, there are a lot of things they can do that we can do. They know how to use tools to a certain extent. They have some language capability. But we all recognize that a chimpanzee is not able to design the Hubble telescope or send it into space, much less interpret the information that comes from it. Well, at some level, we are the chimpanzee, right? I mean, our minds, which is, most scientists agree, is the most complex structure that we're aware of in the universe, still has its own limitations. And there's only so much that we can understand, that we're capable of understanding. And I hope to be able to demonstrate where I think in science we have come up against those limitations. So in summary, our senses and our minds are tools which have inherent limitations and are all differently calibrated. We can't check it at the door. It affects every aspect of our lives. It's unavoidable. And as John Polkinghorne says, which is a phrase I like, these are the spectacles behind our eyes. There's nothing we can do about it. René Descartes, who was a French philosopher in the 17th century, struggled with these issues about knowledge, and he found that he could not be certain about the truth of anything he perceived, particularly through his senses. He was skeptical about everything and was unable to find a certain foundation for knowledge. But the one thing that he couldn't doubt is that he was a thinking being. And that was the only truth that he could accept. And that, hence his famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So my conclusion is that all we think we know is in reality a form of belief. Justified in some way, but a form of belief nevertheless. Scientific knowledge, the power of science is that the beliefs that you have about science are very highly justified because of the nature of the scientific method, which I totally agree with. But that's also its greatest limitation. Because if you're outside what science is capable of doing through observation or experimentation, science, you're beyond the scope of what science is capable of providing. But science and scientific justification are limited in other ways. Scientists are subject to the same cognitive limitations that all of us are. They have spectacles behind their eyes as well. And when you're looking at something like the sun rising in the east every morning, that doesn't require a lot of interpretation. But I can tell you, if you are trying to figure out whether all that data that you've collected over months is the Higgs boson with teams of scientists, that requires a lot of interpretation. And so the spectacles behind our eyes come to applies in that situation. Secondly, as I mentioned before, science is a work in progress. The more we learn, the more we recognize we don't know. Even established theories like the Big Bang have their detractors, and there are also observations about the universe that are inconsistent with the Big Bang. There's a lot we don't know. And finally, and as I mentioned before, and I'm going to talk more about this next week, science is based on some key fundamental assumptions about the world that are ultimately metaphysical in nature and science cannot explain. But if any of those are wrong, the whole enterprise falls apart. So despite its power, I think there are reasons to be skeptical about science. And like other forms of knowledge, all scientific knowledge is in reality a form of belief based on incomplete information. So let's talk about some conclusions and takeaways from this session today. Our goal is to determine the proper role of science in understanding reality and understand its limits. We develop information about the external world through our senses, about our internal and subjective world through introspection, intuition, and for religious people, revelation, and through reason applied to both of these spheres. We process this information through the disciplines of philosophy, science, and theology. Human beings are processors of information who are all calibrated differently, and we experience the world in different and unique ways. What we know or believe is imperfect and incomplete. All we think we know is in fact a form of belief. And what we believe to be true should impact the way we live our lives. So that's a summary of what we've talked about today. Next week, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about physics and what it tells us about reality, fundamental structure of the physical world, and then how we develop theories about the world. So that's it for today. I will be happy to take any questions if any of you have any. I will try to answer them.
Will you provide any text that we need if there's to be any outside reading or anything, or will you provide us with some sort of an handout or syllabus or whatever?
You know, I really thought about doing that, but the scope of this is so extensive in terms of the different disciplines. I decided to try to do bibliography or something was probably beyond what I could do. I mean, I'll be glad if you have specific areas you're interested in that I know something about, I'll be glad to try to provide some information. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you think you possibly call this a tie between heaven and dark energy?
I'm sorry, what?
There's going to be a link between heaven and dark energy.
I haven't made that link yet. I will talk about dark energy, but I haven't made that particular link yet.
I mean, there's going to be an afterlife that's going to take place someplace.
Right. Anyone else?
John?
Yes, sir.
You talked about one truth, and how does one truth relate to the term objective reality or objective truth? Are they similar or are they different concepts?
Really, I think the better way probably to look at that is as opposed to relativism, where each person has their own truth. And I assume some people believe they can have their own truth and it's different from your truth. This is really, yes, there isn't from my perspective, there is an objective reality. And what I'm trying to do is figure out what that is. Yes.
John, you've covered a lot of territory with this, and I'm just curious, did you start out on one path, and wander over here, and wander over there, and then pull all this together recently, or what have been in the plan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my primary focus has been on physics over the years, and I have no interest in doing the math, but I'm fascinated by what we found out about it. And so that's really been my primary focus, and so the physics part and the universe part, pretty straightforward for me. I've read some about evolution and the creation of life, the formation of life, but putting it all together was a bit of a challenge. I knew these things in the back of my head, but actually trying to present them to somebody else takes a little effort. Anybody else?
Will I see the video here, will the talks be available online somehow? Is that a thought?
That is a thought, but not anytime immediately. We are recording this, but we're not sure how we're going to use it yet.
All right.
Anyone else? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And please stay and have a glass of wine.